Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adrian Cunnington, and I'd like to welcome you to this third webinar in our storage webinar series. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about maleic hydrazide, a foundation for storage. And I'm joined this afternoon by Adrian Bridden, colleague from Sutton Bridge, Jeff Hailston from UPL, and Andrew Wilson from CJ Wilson in Slingsby, Yorkshire. So this afternoon, we're going to be working our way through a number of presentations. You will all be on mute, and we would ask you to submit any questions through the questions panel on the software, GoToWebinar software. Our time frame is to try to cover the presentations in about the first hour of this webinar, and then we'll have good time for questions afterwards. I will take questions of clarification immediately after any presentations, but in the main we will try and keep the questions to the end of the session. We do have basis and Noroso points available. If you haven't registered for those already, then you can submit your details confidentially on the questions panel, and they will be passed through and you will get the points. So please do that if you need to. I just need to advise everybody we are recording this session so that it can be broadcast at a later date. So please be aware of that, and we will, without further ado, move on. Okay, so the batting order this afternoon will be Adrian Bridden up first, then we'll have Jeff, and then we'll have Andrew. So if we can move to the next slide, please. These are the titles of their presentations. Adrian will be talking about MH as a base treatment for sprout suppression. Jeff, best practice for maleic hydrazide use, and focusing particularly on Phasor, which is the product of his company. And then we'll be getting a grower view on the use of MH as the foundation for storage from Andrew. Next slide, please. So before we start, I just thought it would be useful to have a quick poll to get some views from our audience. So if you're able to answer this question, we'll come back to the results later. But are you using maleic hydrazide on your stored potatoes? You can answer yes simply to control volunteers in the field. Second option is also for control, for sprout control without other chemicals, so relying on maleic hydrazide on its own. Third option for sprout control, but with other chemicals, so you're topping up with other products. Or fourth item is not using MH at all. So if you'd like to have a few seconds to think about your answer there and then place your vote. Thank you for that. And without further ado, we'll move on to our first presentation, which is going to be from Adrian Bridden. And I'll hand over to Adrian now.
Okay, thank you very much. This is AB from Sutton Bridge, and I'm going to talk now for about 15 or 20 minutes, mostly about maleic hydrazide. I've got a couple of slides late on showing the latest results, so from 6 months storage, but we'll get there in a moment. Right, so maleic hydrazide, very interesting. So it was identified back in 1949, a long time ago, and then first became established on potatoes in the 70s on processing crops in the USA. In the UK, there was limited clearance in 1984 and then full approval in 1985. The MRL went from, well, started off at 50 parts per million, and that then later was revised up to 60 milligrams per kilogram. A few years ago, in fact 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago, you may remember there was quite a bit of stuff in the news then about additional restrictions on MH, and in particular there was talk of a label restriction on stock feed. Right, all that stuff has gone now, so that related not to a data problem but related to a data gap. So that gap has been filled, and we are left with a product that has a good profile, good environmental profile, a good profile in the EU. So it has been recently reviewed. So we look forward to a long life with it. Right, can I have the next slide, please? Right, maleic hydrazide is applied as a foliar spray, so it goes onto the plant, and the stage at which it goes on is quite important, and I'm sure Jeff will come in and tell us a bit more about this. So if we look at product labels, they will give us a couple of factors that we need to adhere to. So one is the quality of the canopy, two is quality of the tubers or the size of the tubers, and also timing relative to burn off. But as I say, we'll let Jeff fill us in on that. Once the application is made, we then require the maleic hydrazide to get across the surface of the leaf into the phloem, and from there it is then translocated to the tubers. And I'll talk a lot more about residue levels shortly. If we move on to the next slide, please. If we look at the CRD database, there's actually in excess of 20 products, 20 pesticide products registered or with approval. The majority of those are herbicides, so very often in association with pelargonic acid. These are the products that we have registered for potato and onion at the moment. And there are also additional minor extensions for minor use on shallots, garlic, etc., and also some fruits. All the products are pretty much supplying the same, so they are all approvals for the application of 3 kilograms of active substance per hectare, though there are obviously differences between formulations. So we have a soluble concentrate, etc. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so the purpose or the field of use of maleic hydrazide, traditionally, and I guess when we had CIPC, probably the main use for maleic hydrazide was for volunteer control in potatoes. But the label is very clear. So the label says that maleic hydrazide is for sprout control in stored potato and stored onion, and for volunteer control in potato. I think the importance of maleic hydrazide, or I think we've just started now to understand how important maleic hydrazide can be for storage of potatoes, particularly as storage becomes longer term. So once we're beyond, let's say, Christmas. Right. In addition, there are some other benefits of using maleic hydrazide. So first of all, second growth, And again, Jeff will speak about this a little bit more, and internal sprouting. So in our work, we see good control of internal sprouting. And I think that's actually going to become more important as we move away from CIPC and to newer products, especially when they're volatile products. So that does become an aspect, in my opinion. Right, and all the while, there is a risk of a yield penalty. So this has been identified in the literature, and I'm sure growers that are using MH will be aware of it. And again, Jeff will talk about that, and we can certainly talk about it in the discussion. I wonder if the concerns about that risk of a yield penalty actually are encouraging growers to apply the maleic hydrazide later, perhaps when crops are becoming a little more senescent and therefore not getting the full benefit of maleic hydrazide. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, please? Right, this is the first experiment that I'm going to tell you about. This is a piece of work that we did looking at the effect of residue on efficacy. So what we did for two varieties, we applied maleic hydrazide at 10, 25, 50, and 100% rates in 400 litres of water. That crop was then lifted, hand lifted, with all the plants lifted individually. Returned to Sutton Bridge, we then subdivided all the tubers from each plant systematically on the basis of size into two subsamples. One sample was immediately sent for residue testing, and then the second sample was put into store at 9 degrees C and efficacy assessed after the storage period. If we move on a slide, please, Christian. Right, if we look then at the residue concentration, right, so this is the first question, if you like, or the first item for discussion later. Right, what we see is that the residue concentration is proportional, pretty much proportional to input rate. So 50% gives us half as much as 100%, which gives us twice as much as the 25% rate. Okay, so that's quite straightforward. But one variety, so Titan here, is 100% more efficient at getting residue into tubers than Piper, and that's quite interesting. So this is the same application, the same investment, yet the return we're getting on that investment is going to be quite different. All right, if we pop onto the next slide now. Right, this is for Titan. This is just an example of the various treatments. And what we see is that the 10% rate is almost, you can't really discern a difference between the 10% and the untreated samples. Once we get up to the 25%, there is clearly an effect, and then 50 and 100%, there is clearly a lack of sprouting. Right, so we can measure all this sprouting and plot it. And if you move on to the next slide, please. Right, so now we've got a plot where maleic hydrazide residue is plotted against sprout weight, so against efficacy. And what we can see is that it's nothing like a straight line. It's actually a very strong curve. Right, this data we can replot into what I call an inhibition curve. So if we just move on to that next slide, what we see is, so there is a very strong curve, obviously, to the data, and what we see is that at modest residue levels, so at a residue concentration of around 4 parts per million, we have got something like 65% inhibition of sprouting. If we double that concentration up to the 8 part per million maleic hydrazide residue point, then there is only a small improvement in sprout control. So the curve is moving gradually around that corner. So we're getting gradually less and less sprout control from our increasing residue concentration. Right, but I don't think that, right, I don't use that as an encouragement for you to not worry about applications and targeting high residue levels. If we move on to the next slide, one of the reasons for that is here. So we talk about 5 parts per million, or we talk about 10 parts per million residue level. Right, there is actually probably not a single potato in there that has 10 parts per million. It's always a range. And actually the range is something like 60 or 70% of the mean. So the lowest concentration that we see is something like, if the average was 10, then the lowest concentration would be around 6, and the highest would be around 15 parts per million. So we always need to think about that lowest residue concentration. And the reason why is because that is the one that is driving things in store. So it's the one that will start sprouting the earliest, and it's the one that will prompt application of a post-harvest treatment. Okay, let's look now at another piece of work. Next slide, please, Christian. Right, so for just a little bit of background, so for maleic hydrazide to control sprouting, we need free residue in the cells. And there are reports that residue levels would or do drop during storage as it becomes bound, probably to cell wall components, and so it becomes unavailable. Right, we are, the data that we have at Sutton Bridge is not supporting that. So what we find, and the data here is just one season. This is a complete season. So this is a lot of samples here. And we are not getting any trend in this data other than that it's flat, tending to flatline. So residue concentration is maintained during storage. So just with this one, I'll just give you a little clue. So variety royal here, I'll be coming back to because this is a variety that is consistently low in our work compared with Innovator. Now, I know Innovator looks like it's moving around a lot here. I'm afraid statistically that is a flat line. Right, and then the final point on this slide, and this comes directly from a review by Dennis Buckley, Eric Anderson, and Harry Duncan, a review of maleic hydrazide, and they made this comment. So 10 years of PRC, so this is the government data, showed no sample to exceed even 50% of the maximum residue level. Right. And our data at Sutton Bridge is pretty much carrying on that trend. So we might be using quite a bit of MH or using it on many crops, but it's not. It is not providing. The residue levels are still generally quite low. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right, so I mentioned that the residue level is maintained. In our data, the residue level is maintained. And that is important for us, in my view here, for the control of internal sprouting. So this is in Project 1043, so the same data for which which I showed the residue data a moment ago. Here we cut, for each treatment combination, we cut 100 tubers and sought internal sprouting. If maleic hydrazide was used, internal sprouting was very rare. Right, the reason for that, can I have the next slide, please? Right, the reason for that is I think maleic hydrazide provides, well, I've said it already, the residue is maintained in the tuber. So it provides a level of sprout inhibition for the duration that that tuber is viable. Right, and I think that's going to become more important, certainly in the interim period, as we learn to use some of the new volatile sprout suppressants. So I've tried to explain this in a schematic. So basically, we've got this horizontal, a thick horizontal blue line. That is the border between sprout inhibition and sprout growth. So at some point, a potato breaks dormancy and sprout growth is initiated. That is detected by the store manager, and an application of a sprout suppressant is made. That sprout suppressant stops sprouting, but if it is volatile, it will be lost from the store and hence lost from the tubers in time as the store is flushed for CO2 or as the store leaks. And at some point, those tubers will drop below the line and sprout growth will again be initiated. And this clearly happens. So the store manager will detect new sprouting, and he will then get a contractor in to carry out another application. Right, this repeated cycling between growth and growth inhibition is, I think, a problem in that they're the conditions under which we would expect internal sprouting. So internal sprouting is very often, or many people consider it to be a response to underdosing, or underdosing increases the risk of internal sprouting. Right, sorry, can I have the next slide, please, Christian? Right, this is a piece of work that Glyn Harper showed at last month's webinar, and this is basically pre-packed crops, so stored at 4.5 for 9 months, and then at the end of that 9 months, they are removed from store. The sprouting is measured, and they're put in to shelf life. So in pre-packed storage nowadays, we store potatoes at lower than 4.5. So very often there will be no sprouting evident on those potatoes for long periods of time. And actually, sprout control in many instances is about controlling sprouting during shelf life. And what this plot shows, so this plot here is specifically the sprout growth that occurs during shelf life. Right, there's quite a bit of up and down for the different products here, but the reason I put it up is because it shows again that maleic hydrazide here is important for maintaining low sprouting levels during shelf life. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right, I usually present results from the work on alternative sprout suppressants for processing crops, and today is no different. And the way I do that is usually I pick the variety that has the lowest residue concentration and the variety that has the highest residue concentration. Can I have the next slide, please? Right, on this occasion, unusually, on this occasion, it was the varieties Royal and Performer. Right, so what do I get from this? I see both varieties. Maleic hydrazide is giving us a significant reduction in sprouting relative to the untreated samples. But here, so this is with Performer with what is an unusually high residue level by our standards. Actually, up until 6 months storage, there was no need for any post-harvest treatment on that crop. So that was at 6 months, so that was in April, and we will be going back to those stores again next week to see how they have fared. But again, this demonstrates the importance of residue and why we should maximize residue concentration during storage. Right, and can I have my final slide, please? Right, this is just for discussion, really. This is the study that we've carried out now for 4 seasons. This is the alternative sprout suppressants work. And what I've done is I've averaged the maleic hydrazide residue information here by variety and by season. So we've had the same 5 varieties throughout. And what we see is a variety interaction. So what this is, I'm not exactly certain, but there is, to my mind, a clear trend towards Innovator having a high residue concentration and Royal having a relatively low concentration. So Royal in this work always had the lowest concentration of MH. So that has been of interest, and this year we've actually set up a trial at the spot farms where we've used the crop foresight modeling to set up a trial where we can treat those treat varieties of contrasting determinacies on the same day, so that we take out the effect of timing of treatment. And then the other observation was the seasonal one. So a lot of people have said last year was a good one for MH application. Well, our data certainly supports that. In fact, our data is suggesting that crop that is in store at the moment has round about twice the residue concentration that we saw in 2017-18 and 2019-20. And right, and that's it. I just put those out really as areas for discussion.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That was excellent. I think we've got 1 or 2 questions, but I think we'll come back to those as part of the discussion, if that's okay. So if we can move on, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Jeff Hailstone. He is the technical manager for UPL, and he's going to talk about optimizing the use of Phasor, maleic hydrazide. Here he is. That's great. Welcome, Jeff, and please give us your presentation.
Thank you. Can you actually see the title slide there, Adrian?
I can, yeah.
Right, good. Right, sorry, just having a bit of trouble moving the slide on. Right, that's it. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. When Adrian asked me really just to focus this presentation on how to get the best out of maleic hydrazide in practical use. And I think the first thing is to say that I appreciate that some of you listening in have been using or advising or even researching this product for literally decades. Some, dare I say, even since it was first approved in the UK in 1985, if that isn't too rude. So I don't want to get into teaching grannies to suck eggs, because a lot of you have got far more practical use on this than I have. But we can use it as a backdrop to the discussion. I hope we can have a lively discussion on your experiences with it, what questions still need answering, because I think there's a lot of questions still need answering, what has worked and what hasn't worked. But in addition to that, there'll be others of you that are first-time users of the product, or you've only used it with CIPC as a backup. And you recognise that the loss of CIPC, as Adrian has just said, was really a game changer. In a way, we're starting from scratch with sprout suppression in stores. It's much more difficult than it was before. It's certainly more expensive. So attention has to be paid to every detail to get the best out of the MH application and from the whole program if we're to be successful. So I'll be looking at mainly at optimizing performance and the factors that affect that in the field, but I also will just touch on secondary growth and control of volunteers, which AB has already mentioned there. So how do we get the best out of MH? What I've done is I've just divided these into 4 categories, just to make it a bit easier to follow. As Adrian's already said, you know, MH, maleic hydrazide, is quite a unique sprout suppressant in as much as it's, you know, applied to the growing crop in the field. It's a plant growth regulator. It's taken up by the crop, translocated down to the tubers, where it inhibits cell division but not cell expansion. So it's quite unique from that point of view. But yeah, if we run through in turn when to put it on, how best to apply it, the importance of a healthy crop and a good canopy, and then the weather conditions, how some weather conditions will help the uptake of movement and others will hinder it. So it's really all the focus in terms of getting it on in the field is about maximizing the uptake and the translocation. So that's what you should always bear in mind. First, the timing then. You need to wait until the marketable tubers are a minimum of 25 millimeters. That's because that's the point where the cell division is complete in the tubers. The MH works at stopping cell division. So as long as you get on after that point, there won't be any yield loss. And Adrian mentioned, you know, that there have been concerns over yield loss, but so long as the tubers that you need to go through to completion are that size or larger, there won't be a yield loss from the MH. Now, typically that's, excuse me, 3 to 5 weeks before desiccation. You probably want to be aiming at 5 weeks, and then if the weather's not suitable, that gives you a bit of leeway before, you know, senescence is likely to start. So the crop at that stage, most of the flowers will probably have fallen. There may be some drying of leaves at the base of the plant, but you don't want senescence to have started. If you go too early, then you can inhibit cell division, and that would cause a yield reduction. If you go too late, which is probably more often the case, and the canopy is starting to senesce, then the translocation of the active down to the tubers will be reduced and the efficacy will be reduced. So that's the timing, and this is just a pictogram to demonstrate that. This is in the best use guide that we have, so as a reminder. So that's what the plant will be like on the left, and on the right there, that just shows that the cell division is complete at 25 millimeters, and then the cells can carry on expanding after that, so there's no yield loss. How should we put it on then to get the best out of it? I think it's very important that you keep the water volume up, a minimum of 350 litres per hectare, maybe up to 500 litres, and that you have a slow forward speed. You want to get as good a coverage of the canopy as you possibly can, but you also want the droplets to be drying quite slowly. I think we know that the uptake is better if the droplets are drying slowly on the leaf, and that's also affected by the relative humidity, which I'll come on to. Adrian's already shown the effect of cutting the use rate, so these are things that you can actually influence. The weather sometimes you can't, but it makes sense to optimize the things that you can actually influence, and the use rate is obviously one of them. So 5 kilos per hectare of phasor, which is 3,000 grams active. If you were using a different formulation, it's always 3,000 grams active. The best advice that we have at the moment is not to tank mix with anything. Now we've had particular issues with mancozeb. Work is ongoing to look at different blight products. Obviously, the mancozeb may not be with us for all that long, but we are looking at a range of blight products to see if there are some that you could use. But of course, very often the blight product is going to go on in a lower water volume. So in that case, you would want to avoid it anyway, because you'd be compromising the phasor on the water volume. As far as sequencing with blight products, always better to put the phasor on first and then follow up with the blight application afterwards. And I'll show you a trial that backs that up. As far as mixing with adjuvants, again, some adjuvants have speeded up the activity, but some have had dramatically the opposite effect. So again, there's I think a lot more work needed to look at adjuvants and which ones help and which ones hinder. So the advice at the moment is not to mix with adjuvants. And really, given that blight sprays, you're putting on 10 or 12 blight treatments. I know it's and they tend to be on a 7-day program. You're only putting the phasor on once, and it is very important to get it right. So I would consider fitting the blight programs around the phasor application rather than the other way around, so you can get the phasor in the best possible condition. So here's a trial from 2019 that just looks at the dose response for phasor. Adrian showed you one that showed a more dramatic drop off than this, but all the residue levels here, as you can see, were below the sort of 12 milligrams per kilo that we're sort of aiming for as a target. In the next trial, you'll see they were a lot higher, but really it just goes to show, stick with the full rate. We've got a mixture with Ranman top there that doesn't show any negative effect on the loading of the MH in this trial, but in other trials, there was one done in Holland quite recently that showed the opposite. So just sort of confirming that we need to do more work there. And on the right, where there's no bar at all, that was mixed with an adjuvant that's there to reduce drift, and it had a very negative effect. So that was, again, just emphasizing that more work's required on the adjuvants. And then a trial here from 2020 that looks at mixtures and sequences with mancozeb, and this does seem to be a particular problem. You can see that mixing the mancozeb with the phasor roughly halved the residue levels. The adjuvant in there had a similar effect, and even putting the mancozeb on either 1 or 3 days before the phasor, you were still getting roughly a halving of the residue levels, even though they were all, comfortably above the minimum. In other situations, if the weather was less suitable and all of those bars were moved down, you'd be into a problem area. So that was how to put it on. And then looking at crop health and weather, as far as the crop health is concerned, you want a green canopy, healthy. Take particular care with determinate varieties, because they of course can tip from being green and healthy to senescing quite quickly. Make sure the crop's well hydrated in the run up to the application. And that it's free from anything that might compromise the movement of the MH down the stems. So that might be verticillium or other black dot or other diseases that might affect it, or a pest attack, or physical damage from wheelings, lodged crops, etc. So anything that could compromise that, obviously you're going to do the best you can to avoid that. In terms of the weather, you can't influence the weather, but you can avoid the weather that we know is going to be detrimental. So temperatures, daytime temperatures above 25 degrees C, avoid those. If it is warm during the day, then spray in the evening. Try to get a high relative humidity. We know that helps, at least 75% we would recommend, so that the droplets dry slowly on the leaf. Now there's a lot more work required with regard to droplet size and coverage. Is it better to have small droplets with more of the surface area covered, or fewer larger droplets? I think we know that slow drying helps, but again, there is more work to be done in terms of application. Don't be tempted to spray at night. We need the stomata all open to help with the uptake. And make sure you've got at least 24 hours after application for the spray to dry on the leaf. Now, as Adrian's already said, 2020 was a good year for Phasor application and uptake. That's part of that is going to be down to the weather, but I think part of it is also down to the growers paying a bit more attention and focusing a bit more on the Phasor, knowing that the CIPC wasn't there. So I think, you know, big strides have already been taken towards taking care of the Phasor application. But if we do just look at just one snapshot situation here, this was a site that resulted in a loading of 34 parts per million, so very healthy residue, and it went on quite late here, 4th of September. But you can see that the temperatures leading up to application were relatively mild, not too hot at all, the maximum of 20 degrees the day before. But there was plenty of rainfall, so there was no moisture stress for the crop. Quite a number of rainfall events there in the lead up. And then immediately afterwards, again, we had a maximum temperature of 24 degrees 4 days afterwards. So warm, but not hot, and very little rainfall immediately afterwards. So, you know, we know it dried successfully on the leaf. So this is sort of the conditions that you would hope to get. So the effect on sprouting in store, Adrian shown you some data, a lot more recent data than this, and he's got a lot more data, but this just goes to show, this was from back in 2010. Phasor applied in July, more of a sort of a normal timing. The crop was harvested in September and then stored for 10 months at 4 degrees C. And on the left-hand side, you've got sprouting index, which measures the number and the length of the sprouting, sort of weighted towards the longer sprouts. And then on the right, you've got the length of the maximum sprout. So whichever one you look at, you can see this is just Phasor on its own. There was no follow-up treatment in store. You can see that it's evened out the sprouting between the varieties, 9 different varieties here. It's evened it out a lot, and that should help the performance of the follow-up treatments in store, and it should help with the timing of the first one as well. If you've got more than one variety in store, it's going to help if the least dormant one is sprouting later, so that you don't have to go in earlier just for one variety. So it should help with the management as well. Right, secondary growth is a problem after we've had, or can be a problem with certain varieties after you've had a stress period, followed by that stress being relieved by rainfall and lower temperatures. It can cause not only deformed tubers, chain tuberization, knobby tubers, etc., but also a movement of starch from the secondary, from the main tubers to the secondary tubers. So that can cause problems with glassiness and also conversion of starch to reducing sugars and all the knock-on effects for fry colors, acrylamide levels, and so forth. So it's not something that we want at all in the field. Whether the Phasor can help or not depends very much on the timing of the stress event with your normal timing for sprout control. Now, that's unlikely to coincide in June, but it might coincide in July. So the timing, this is mainly from looking in the literature rather than any recent work that we've done. But it would seem to be best to apply it 2 to 3 days after the stress period is finished. So if you've had a stress period, then you've had rainfall, another 2 or 3 days after that, and you could tell if there was secondary growth starting to appear by having a look in the field, and that would be the best timing. And if that coincides with the size of the tubers and the length of time before burn down, etc., then you could expect to get some quite decent control of secondary growth. This was the only trial I've been able to find. It's quite an old one. And the russet Burbank does seem prone to secondary growth with the tuber shape. And the phaser reduced it by half in this trial, so it can be quite useful. And then on volunteers, we know that you can get a huge number of potatoes left behind the harvester, and we know that they will survive. A lot of them will survive a mild winter. We're getting a lot more of those, and they can remain viable for up to 8 years and will produce daughter tubers themselves. Not only are they a problem in other crops in the rotation, competing for light, water and nutrients, but I think more importantly, they can act as a source for disease, late blight, black dot, etc., and as a home for virus vectors and PCN. And of course, we've got more problems with virus, with loss of some insecticides and aphid resistance, and we've lost vidate as well. So the PCN management situation is going to be harder. So I think volunteers are something we need to focus on right through the rotation, and this can certainly help as far as spraying in the potato crop. And you can get a very high level of control. This trial here was 9 varieties. The chart at the top is looking at average sprout length, and you can see the phaser has had a big effect there. And then they were planted out, and it gave almost complete control of volunteer emergence. Now, I should say that these were tubers of sort of the size that would be stored. So in practice, behind the harvester, you're going to have a lot of smaller ones that won't accumulate the MH to the same level. So you're not going to get the same control on the emergence of those as you would with the larger ones. But it's still going to have a considerable effect on volunteers. So last slide, just to summarize then, the maleic hydrazide, we know it's good as a basis for your in-store sprouting. In some situations, it may be all you need if for certain markets, if you're not storing for very long. Adrian's already covered internal sprouting, which is going to become more of an issue. And it's boosting the performance of the follow-up treatments as well. It can even up sprouting across varieties. It may allow a slightly warmer storage temperature, so giving you less of an issue with fry colour. And then the additional benefits of secondary growth in the field and the volunteer control. And it is relatively cheap and very cost effective. It's only approximately £2 per tonne for the application. You're only putting it on once as well. So it is the cheapest available sprouting treatment. You need to get the residue as high as possible because some of the factors are out with your control, particularly the weather. So, and you only know the residue levels from testing after the event. So when you're putting it on, you want to try and get everything as close to optimal as you can. And although there's an MRL of 60 parts per million, as Adrian says, you don't often get very close to that at all. So that shouldn't be a concern. Don't use on seed crops or first earlies, and follow the best use guidelines with all of the application details. So I think that's the last one. Yeah, that's all from me. Thank you very much, and I'll hand you back to Adrian.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was very comprehensive, and we do have some questions in. So again, we'll come back to those in a moment. I want to bring Andrew Wilson into the discussion because he's been sitting there waiting for us for some time. So Andrew, if you're able to join us, that would be great.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Andrew.
Afternoon, Adrian.
Yes, thank you for agreeing to speak on this webinar this afternoon. We're going to have more of a discussion to kick off with, and then hopefully Adrian and Jeff will join us as we go along, so we can widen that out. But could you start by giving us a short introduction to your business, please, just so that everybody who's listening can understand where you're at with your potato production and storage?
Sure, yeah. Potato is the biggest enterprise on the farm, alongside sugar beet, combinable crops, pigs, and other bits and bats. We've slowly increased our scale over the last 20 years to a peak in 2017, and I've actually dropped back a little bit and stopped on the ex-field contracts, which has made life a little bit easier and not no less profitable, I must add. We now store everything that we grow, which varies between November movements, which sees MH and nothing else, right through to the end of March, which usually runs sometime into April. Bulk ambient stores in the main of varying different ages. The oldest store, the least good, if you like, we like to get empty before Christmas because of we usually get a lot more frost in January than we do before Christmas. That's the key reason for that, and that store we generally get by on MH in that store. It's always a little bit of a gamble. We have on odd occasion, if it's been a hot season and an early harvest, we have put one gas on that in time gone by, but it's some years since we did that. We have ethylene in one store for one particular customer, and mint oil for another. So we've got the full spectrum.
Okay, so you're getting information.
We're all processing for chipping and crisping.
Okay, yeah. So you're getting information on all the options then, by the sound of it. So just
storage temperature varies between 7.5 and 12, depending on the variety.
Yeah. Okay. And what's your biggest challenge with MH?
Getting it on at the right time, and the key difficulty to us is on unirrigated land in a dry, hot season, is getting the best timing for the product without having any knockback, and that in a hot, dry summer is quite difficult. We have seen dormancy break on some varieties in July, and it's really, really hot temperatures. It's far too dry. You're concerned you're going to be knocking the stuffing out of the potatoes, but yet you're going to see some secondary growth if it comes a dollop of rain. You're going to see some yield penalties. It's very much a compromise. A bit easier on irrigated crops. I mean, last season we were probably a little bit more careful, a little bit more cautious, a little bit more than normal, determined to get it right. I suppose attention to detail is the common denominator there. And Innovator, I think we're a little bit early. It's a determinate variety. We felt it was starting to go back. With hindsight, we're probably 5 to 7 days early. There was some crisping stuff that we got as spot on as I think we could have got it, that we didn't need to do anything else until the beginning of February. And we had so similar with some royal, although we did see some knockback on some royal. It was a bit later applied on the royal and the crisping because it's a longer season variety. And by that time, we're into the hotter temperatures. We did try a split dose, 250% doses. I didn't see as much knockback, so that's something we'll look at again this season. And some other crisping stuff on some drier land, a little touch of PCA and stress, too much temperature. We're a little bit late putting it on that one. So lessons have been learned. Whether we'll be able to, on the back of that, do things better next season very much depends on the season.
Okay, well, you've raised a couple of points there that I would like to pick up on. One was on what you call knockback, with balancing the uptake with yield, basically. So I don't know if Jeff wants to comment on that at all in relation to what Andrew's doing, and maybe also for you, Jeff, the concept of using split doses.
Yeah, on the split doses first, we've only done one trial looking at that, and it was neither beneficial nor detrimental. I think that it came out with a very similar level of residue, but we haven't done much on that. As far as the yield is concerned, yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, would you say, Andrew, that you're getting that effect when it's very, very hot, sort of over 30 degrees around the timing of the application?
We desperately try and avoid anything above 23 or 4 degrees. It tends to be evening when we're applying. But the reason I picked up on it really was it was just half a tram line. I stopped halfway down the tram line, and didn't do that with 100%. I did that with 50%. And then I came back a week later and put the other 50% on, and you could see to the line, right? I had it mapped on GPS, so I knew where it was, where I started and stopped it. You could see to the line that the crop went back much quicker, where it had 100% in one hit. but I couldn't put a particular reason on anything at the point of application. But the weather before it, and to a certain extent after it, wasn't as cool and as nice as you would have hoped for. The crop was undoubtedly under a little bit of stress at the point of application, but the 50% dose didn't knock the crop, the 100% did. Not significantly. With hindsight, I wish I'd done some more digs and taken some samples and monitored dormancy break on that. That hindsight's marvellous, isn't it? But the line in the crop from the boom was noticeable.
Yeah. As I say, we've got very little data ourselves. It may be something that we need to, add to the list of questions that we don't have the answers to, and see if we can get some work done.
I think there's an increasing amount of questions we don't have answers to, and one thing that we're monitoring this time is cumulative temperature and day degrees, looking at physiological age of the daughter crop. And I come to that point from the dormancy break, particularly in Royal, in sometimes mid-July. In hot seasons, Adrian's figures showed higher residue. Is that better uptake because of the condition of the crop at that point? I'm not sure. Is it how close it is to dormancy break? I think the 3 to 5 weeks thing is a very, very rough guide. And we tend to be aiming more for 5 than 3. It's not often we're near 3 really. But from the last couple of seasons' experience, I think that is key. Is that point in time when the crop is getting closer towards sprouting, and some of the sprouts we've seen in the field are quite significant in hot summers. And if that happens, we're seriously fighting it in store, and we don't have the tools that we once had to do that battle. So we need to try and get it on better. And there's undoubtedly a compromise. You can, as you pointed out, you can put it on too early. Sometimes you're better sacrificing a little bit of yield, a little bit of total yield to improve the percentage saleable yield.
Yeah. AB, have you got any comments on the whole issue of fizz age and determinacy as well, and all that side of?
Yeah, so it all gets pretty complicated, doesn't it, when we start dealing with things in the field?
Yeah, no, they are.
So yes, I guess I just have lots more questions too. So with regard to the split dose, okay, that looks really interesting. But right, so first of all, the knockback. So this is the phytotoxic response. Does that give you a yield penalty?
Not measurably, no.
And secondly, if you split the dose, right, is your volume of water actually changing? So if you're doing 2 applications at 1.5 kilos or 2.5 kilos of phaser, so if you do 2 half-rate applications, is the volume of water, the total volume of water, actually higher?
I guess it is. If you're putting, I tend to run at around about 400 litres, and I must confess that sometimes the field size and the sprayer size does dictate a little bit as to where the total water level gets to. On that trial I did, the whole of the field that got 100% was done at 400 litres, and the half a tram line that got 50% the first time round was done at 200, but the second dose of 50% was done at 400. So yes, the total water was higher across the piece, but applied in 2 different doses. I think water can be too high. Is at what point do you start getting runoff? How much water is too much, if you like. I tend to use angled nozzles for all the blight sprays and potato applications, and aim for 3 to 4 bar slow speed, round about 400 litres. But there's little point putting it on for it to be running off. As ever, there's a happy medium to be had somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. If you were wanting, if you were not risk averse, so if you like to gamble, I'll put this to Jeff as well. If you like to gamble, right, and you wanted a crop to get a good high residue value, and you're going to risk a little bit of a yield penalty because it's going for a long-term storage contract, right? What would you do? What change would you make? Do we know what changes to make in order to increase our chance
question, isn't it? That's a $65 million question. It is varietally dependent, and each variety has its Achilles heel, I suppose. One of the key reasons that, sorry, go on.
But as part of that application process, so okay, let me put it another way. Would you go a week earlier, or would you add another 100 litres of water to the Bowser?
Well, the more I learn, the less I know. And a lot of people would say that, I think. And I think we need to pay more attention to the weather, and prioritise the application of the phaser. I mean, Jeff made the point of putting it ahead of blight sprays. I would compromise the water on a blight spray rather than compromise the water on the phaser, and put the maximum attention to it. It depends, as I said, it depends on the variety and the threat to that variety. So Innovator, for instance, suffers quite badly with internal sprout. So it's about more than yield on that, because that can be seriously detrimental to the returns and the quality and the fry colours. Things like Royal, and to a lesser extent Dell, is a bit more succumb to secondary growth and physical natures like that, which sometimes aren't a problem, sometimes are. Contracts have changed a little bit in recent years, which perhaps is a little bit less of a problem than it was. But the secondary growth brings about other issues that come about in store that is sometimes relative to the storage length. If it's only in store for 2 or 3 weeks in November, secondary growth isn't really a problem, but I wouldn't want it in a store for long term.
Yeah.
As we pointed out, it's a $65 million question, but to answer it, no, I wouldn't necessarily go early. And how early is too early? Well, that's what I'm trying to put a bit of structure to it. I don't think it needs to be measured in weeks anymore. I think we need to look at it a little bit more scientifically, which is where I come to with the cumulative temperature. Okay.
Can I bring in some questions from the our listeners? This question: what is the reduction in efficacy if the plant has already started to senesce? So how much of a drop off in efficacy are we likely to see? Maybe Jeff, you could take that one to start with.
I guess it's a bit how long is a piece of string, but I think anything that compromises the uptake and the translocation is going to reduce the residues. So you know, as soon as the canopy is starting to senesce, that's going to be less efficient, I think. Whether that's going to be an issue in practice will depend on so many other factors. If it reduces it by a few percentage points because it's only just started senescing, and everything else is spot on, and you're still well above the levels in the tubers that you need for sprout suppression, it maybe not have any practical importance. But I think really, you know, we should be aiming to try and get it as early as possible, rather than looking to how late can we go, you know, and get away with it. I mean, if everything's against you and you just can't get it on, I suppose you might be faced with a situation: is it worth spraying at all, or do I just give up on it? And I don't have the answer to that as to what stage the uptake and translocation ceases, but I guess your start of senescence, you're going to get some, and hopefully it would do something, and then it's just a choice in the field as to whether that's worth it or not. I don't know if Adrian's
can I come in there for a minute?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
On the back of last season, as I mentioned before, I think we're a little bit early putting in our Innovator, and my timing was pretty much as you've described it, just at the very, very start of senescence. And in very simple farmer language, I suppose, when the crop senesces, to me, it puts what energy it's got in its canopy into its tubers. It's bulking like hell at that point. So the key to getting the chemical to work is getting it into the tubers. We don't want it in the top, we want it in the tubers. So I think I was a little bit early on the Innovator. I think the flowers are dropped, but only just all finished. I think we need to be a little bit further into senescence, which on a determinate variety like Innovator, in a warm summer, it was an irrigated crop, so it wasn't particularly stressed, but senescence can happen very, very quickly. I think we need to be looking at crops every 2 or 3 days, certainly not every week, and that is fairly crucial. I think it can come down to a couple of days, but I do think that the too early piece does have an impact on the residue. I mean, my residue levels that were mid-high teens off the top of my head, 17, 18, I think, which isn't massively high compared to some of the figures we've seen this afternoon. but evidently it wasn't enough to hold the sprouting back well enough in store. There's certainly room for improvement. But on the Brook, which is a fairly lively variety, in fairness, it was a little bit more finesse when we applied it, and I can't fault it how it worked on that, spot on. As good as you could ever. So to get past Christmas without having to put something else on, when you put it in store this first week of October, I thought it was pretty good for fraser. It's as good as I've seen it. So it's
I suppose the answers we don't have are what would have happened in the innovator if you had sprayed it a week later?
Good question. I wish I knew.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course we've in this first season without CIPC, we've had relatively good uptake of maleic hydrazide. If we get a season where things are a lot more marginal, particularly in relation to weather and application time, then that sort of opens up the whole question of how well are we going to be able to control sprouting in store going forward, because that residual component that we get from the maleic hydrazide that Adrian was illustrating is pretty crucial, I think, particularly when we're supplying into markets where there's some shelf life component as well. That becomes pretty essential.
I would agree. Can I just ask Jeff, when does evening become night? You mentioned about having the stomata open. When it cools down in an evening, it can be 7 o'clock before it's cool enough to get a go. When does that become night? Is it as simple as it becomes dark, park the sprayer up? Because if you've got a few acres to get around, there ain't enough hours in that, a couple of hours after tea to do everything.
There's probably some plant physiologists on the call that could fire in the answer to that as to the rate of stomatal closing with daylight. I'm not sure.
I tend to work on doing it on evening rather than first thing in the morning, on the simple basis that the temperatures are cooling. The plant's got time to take it in and get used to it before the sun comes out.
It's probably likely to be a bit more humid.
Well.
Yeah, it's probably likely to be a bit more humid in the evening as well, isn't it, than first thing in the morning?
Definitely.
So that.
Yeah, if everything's laden down with dew, it's going to run off a bit easier as well.
I've got another question here. Have you seen any difference in efficacy between liquid and powder formulations of MH?
Personally, no. I've used both. I used both last season and deliberately using the same set of circumstances to compare, and I can't split them. Very similar.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we'd say the same thing.
For me, it comes down to price on that one. There's with the liquid formations, you have a lot of cans to empty and dispose of. With the powder, I chuck them in the top of the tank to keep the froth down. From an operator's point of view, there's very little between it. So if the product efficacy is the same, it comes down to price.
Jeff, you talked a little bit about avoiding tank mixing. Is that something you do, Andrew? Do you try and?
Yes, although last season less so. I've mixed it with Brandman. I would completely agree on the Mancozeb front. I'll also back you up on what you mentioned in your presentation. The blight spray before the phaser, in my opinion, shouldn't be Mancozeb, because you seem to get more physical residue on the leaf, which stops the phaser getting to it. But I have mixed Ranman with it on a number of occasions in the past, with no detriment for doing that. Although last season I probably only did about 10% of what I did. I put Ranman in with it, and that was more down to a workload and time issue than anything else. Because if both need to be on now, I haven't time to get around everything. I'm going to have to chuck something together, and I did do, and it wasn't detrimental.
Did you have to compromise on the water volume, Andrew, in that situation?
No, I went at 400 litres. I would rather compromise the water volume on the blight product than the MH, on the basis that why would it be too high for the blight spray if it's going to go into if the MH is going to go into the leaf, and so is the blight spray. But normally blight spray at 200 litres, and I would argue that that's not high enough for the MH. It's lower than label rate. I would tend to go at 400 as a rule.
Okay, well, thank you for that insight. I'm just going to ask Christian if we can pull the poll results back, just to have a look at those and just see how people are actually dealing with the use of MH in relation to storage.
Yeah, I'll share them for you now.
Okay, so we've got 25% of people using MH on its own, 60% with other chemicals, and 15% not using MH at all. Nobody actually just using it as a volunteer control, which is perhaps not surprising. Okay, so thanks, Christian. So in terms of those 15% not using MH, I guess that's either very short-term storage or maybe even people who might be concerned about MH residue. Adrian, have you got any comments to make about that in terms of MH residue for certain markets?
Yes, I mean, as I mentioned in my presentation, so maleic hydrazide residues are there, they're systemic, so they're throughout the tuber. Unlike some of the other products, unlike CIPC, residue isn't reduced by peeling. That isn't a disadvantage to some consumers. These days we have companies making judgments not just on MRL but fractions of the MRL. So those companies, yeah, for them maleic hydrazide is always going to be a problem. I think when as an industry, when we deal with this situation, we have to just remind people that these products have gone through the both the EU and now the UK approval process, and they are judged not to add risk in consumers' diets.
Okay, thank you for that. I think it's really important that we sort of stress that point because of the role that MH is playing in storage at the moment, and that residual component, which is very important for getting good performance in store. I just will go back to some input from the question panel. Mark Stallum has sent in, not certain that stomata are shut that long overnight. Katarina Huntenberg's work at NIAB Cuff showed that they opened before dawn. He says, surely MH can enter the following morning if sprayed at night.
The key to that, I think, being dry leaf application.
Yeah, so we've got some other comments coming in as well. Sorry?
Is there any guidance, Jeff, on water hardness? Is it less effective with hard water? Should we be using a water softener?
Not specifically. We have got a trial that we're looking at with a water conditioner this season, so we'll maybe have some more answers on it.
Particularly hard water, so it's not a major issue to me, but I know plenty of people that is a problem.
Yeah, we don't give any specific advice at the moment, one way or the other.
Okay, apologies to Mark. That was a question, not a statement about the entering in the following morning. So, okay,
yeah, I mean, it's a good question, isn't it? Because if the weather is, if you're running out of days to get it on, and the daytime temperatures are way too high, and if you can spray at night, and it stays around until the stomata open and is then taken up, then it's you know, could be a good strategy. I guess, like with so many things, you know, we haven't actually done the work to compare.
Yeah. Mark says
Adrian's thinking about it. Maybe he has done.
Yeah, I'm sure I've had a discussion with someone about how many about varietal characteristics on stomata number. Maybe that's the difference between varieties, not determinacy. I don't know.
And
it's interesting going through some of the older literature, which actually very much points out the importance of humidity as probably this, no, not probably, definitely the single most important environmental factor. So slow drying is key to getting uptake of maleic hydrazide. But I mean, I've wondered myself if it does dry on the leaf, the MH will stay on the leaf, so it is very stable. It's not broken down by UV. So when it rains, it's washed off, so very soluble. Otherwise, it will stay on the leaf. So perhaps if drying conditions are such, perhaps it would be worth applying just water to a previously MH treated crop, just to raise the humidity and extend that drying time. Maybe that's something.
An awful lot of water to make a difference at humidity, Adrian.
Yeah. Amongst the leaves, I don't know.
Well, will 400 or 500 litres a hectare out of a sprayer make a difference? I would question probably not. Would a light irrigation be too much? I would say yes.
Yeah, we should have another a piece of work happening not in the not too distant future, looking at drying time. This will happen in a greenhouse, looking at drying time of an MH application to see if we can basically increase the residue uptake by maintaining very humid conditions after application.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go back on a couple of points. Graham Skinner says the shelf life issue has just come to a head in the last 2 weeks in the fresh trade, especially in the less developed supply chains. Returns for sprouting product have become very serious. So that's something that we need to think about. And it sort of ties into the next point, which has been made by David Hoyles. Many pre-pack growers with more dormant varieties, Lenormand, Camel, etc., have just used temperature control for sprout control and no chemicals for many years, storing up to June and July, which can be very successfully done. But I think the really crucial point there is he's talking about dormancy in relation to the late storage, and I think we do need to be looking more closely at the combination of varieties and chemical use, so that we can be more selective in what we end up having to treat. I think that's an inevitable consequence of chemistry loss.
Yeah, David makes a good point about the temperature. It's quite reliable start control, and it's arguably the thing that's least likely to be taken away from us. You know, look at the products the potato world has lost in the last 2 or 3 years: Vidate, Dicquat, TIPC. Axe hanging over a few more. One must ask what's next. We do need to be looking at less, non-chemical controls of some of these things. Whether that be what varieties will fry at low temperature, what will recondition, but for processing, particularly for crisping, when we smoke crisping stuff, we're storing at 12 degrees. That's high. The sun get a bit lively here past Christmas at 12 degrees. They are lively. We've got to get back from that.
Are we making any progress there? Seems to me we were storing at 10 or 11 when I first started working on potatoes with a variety record.
I have another crisping variety that we store at 9, and Royal and Innovator at 7, 7.5, without too much of a problem. We tend to err outside of caution a little bit and let it start warm up a degree or so before outloading. When outloading takes a month, that can sometimes bite you in the bum with some sprouting that appears. I think the whole industry needs to come together a bit on it, from the scientists like yourselves right through to the factories at the end user, and pull together a little bit more. Particularly if we lose MH, there will be some fever on for sprout control.
Well, you'll be pleased to know, Andrew, that we were looking at some opal in the lab at Sutton Bridge yesterday that had been stored at 6 degrees and had a very good fry colour.
Very pleased to hear that, since this is the first year I've got opal in the ground.
Well, there you go. Okay. Right.
Have you got enough to fill a store, though?
I hope so. But we're a long way from being able to assess the yield at the moment.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm looking to pull things together now and finish the session off. There was one quick question as to whether Jeff would be prepared just to say a very quick word about decision with orange oil. I don't know if that's something you'd be prepared to do, Jeff, please, just to give us an update.
Yeah, not much to say really. It's in the hands of CRD. You know, they're obviously very stretched with the new regime, loss of staff and so forth, new staff. So we're just waiting in anticipation, and that's really all we can say at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the same situation with other products that we're waiting for as well alongside. So particularly DMN, that's been one which has been hanging in the system for quite some time, shall we say? And but I don't think there's any way that CRD are going to be accelerated through their processes. I think they're meticulous in what they do, and that's the way it will be. So it does make the need for MH as a foundation treatment for storage all the more relevant if we're not sure exactly what options we're going to have going into the next season. Anyway, I'd like to thank all of our speakers this afternoon. Thank you to Jeff, thank you to Andrew, and thank you to Adrian for giving us such a comprehensive presentation and discussion on maleic hydrazide and its importance in storage. Whilst I'm talking about storage, I'll just remind you of some of the storage tools that we have on the AHDB system at the moment. The store manager's guide's available on the website through the storage hub. We are still issuing storage bulletins, and you can contact us on the storage advice line as well. The hub also has a comprehensive reserve of information from various trials, and that will be being updated further in the next few weeks. And if you're looking specifically for information on maleic hydrazide, I suggest you go to ahdb.org.uk knowledge-library, beg your pardon, and search for maleic hydrazide, and that should bring up information for you. There's also some information on the handouts tab of the GoToWebinar software, which you can access there as well. So without further ado, I'll just say that this concludes our storage webinar series. As many of you will know, the AHDB position in relation to potatoes and horticulture is quite difficult at the moment. You can find an update on that at that web address. And at this stage, I'll just say thank you very much for watching this afternoon, and wish you all a good evening. Thank you.